The Torah never says Moses wrote the chapter about his own death. In the next few minutes, you're going to see who wrote it. With the Bible verse that records another man writing inside the book of the law and the 4 answers 2,000 years of study gave to this question. Because the Pentateuch does declare 6 times what Moses put in writing, and 3 of those are in the 2 chapters right before the funeral. About the funeral, it says nothing. And the Talmud was already debating who signed those final lines centuries before the printing press existed. The most surprising answer didn't come from a modern critic. It came from a medieval rabbi who believed every word of the book. And 500 years later, a philosopher used it to try to demolish the entire Pentateuch. You'll also see where that philosopher misread the rabbi. This channel holds that Jesus is the Messiah, and this question doesn't move that 1 millimeter. If you're interested, leave me a like now. And if halfway through you think I'm overstating it, take it back without guilt. Let's start with the 6 times the Torah does sign. 3 are scattered along the way. The other 3 come together, 2 chapters before the tomb. The 3 scattered ones are brief and worth noting from the start. In Exodus 17, after the battle against Amalek, God commands that this be written in a book as a memorial and rehearsed in the ears of Joshua. In Exodus 24, Moses writes the words of the covenant and reads them to the people. In Numbers 33, he records in writing the starting points and stopping places of the journey, battle records, covenant text, itinerary. 3 partial files, each with a different recipient and a different purpose. And then come the 3 that matter for our question, all in the same chapter. The first is in Deuteronomy 31, verse 9. The text says that Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant. Notice the construction, because it's surprisingly juridical. It doesn't say Moses spoke, it says he wrote. And it doesn't leave it floating in the air. It names the recipient, it names the object, it names the function of that recipient. It's the language of a custody transfer. The Hebrew verb is katav. It's the common verb for writing, the same one that appears when speaking of engraving on tablets, drafting a divorce document, or inscribing in a scroll. It has no mystical aura. It's the scribe's verb, the craftsman's verb. And the object that receives that verb is Hatorah Hazot, this teaching, this law, a defined body of material, not an indefinite totality of everything that exists. The second signature is 13 verses further in the same chapter, verse 22. There it says that Moses wrote that song and taught it to the sons of Israel, and the song comes right after, occupying all of chapter 32. That archaic poem that opens by calling the heavens to listen. In other words, the text marks the piece, says Moses put it in writing, and then hands it to you. Signature and object side by side. The third is the most solemn of the 3, and it's in verses 24 through 26. It says that when Moses finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, he commanded the Levites to take that book and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant, not inside, beside, as a witness against the people. Stop for a second at what just happened in the narrative. There is a physical object, a sefer, a scroll. It has a declared author, a declared moment of completion, a declared place of deposit, and a declared function. In modern terms, it's an item with documented provenance. The Torah takes the trouble to tell you that scroll existed, who wrote it, when it was finished, and where it was kept. Keep reading. 2 chapters later, in chapter 34, Moses climbs a mountain and dies. And the text does not say who wrote that. It doesn't say Moses foresaw it. It doesn't say it was dictated to him. It doesn't say he left it sealed for later. It simply shifts voice and narrates the death of its protagonist in the third person, with a tranquility that draws no attention to itself. And that's silence, in a book that just signed its name 3 times in the previous chapter. is the loudest thing in the scene. This is where I need to stop you for a moment, because there's a mental move almost all of us make without realizing it. When you hear the question, how did Moses write his own death? Your mind assumes the Bible claims he did. It claims no such thing anywhere. The question doesn't arise from the text. It arises from a tradition about the text. Those are two different things, and separating them weakens nothing. On the contrary, it's what allows you to see what the page is actually doing, because there's something more in those delivery verses, something overlooked because it sounds like an administrative detail. The book doesn't stay in Moses' hands. It passes to the Levites beside the ark. Moses' last action with the document is to release it, and a document that has already changed hands can receive one more line from the hand that received it, without that being fraud or betrayal. It's what an archive does when the archivist closes the file. Hold on to that image of the scroll left beside the ark, because later you'll see a verse in another book of the Bible where someone who is not Moses writes inside that same book. And he does it with complete naturalness, without the text presenting it as a problem. Before getting there, you need to see the traces that chapter 34 left on itself, because this is not a chapter that hides its origin. It's a passage that declares it, in 3 marks visible to anyone who reads slowly. The first mark is 3 Hebrew words, ad hayom hazeh, until this day. They appear in verse 6, where the text says that no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Stop at the phrase. It doesn't say no one knew. It says no one knows to this day. It's a phrase that measures a distance. Someone speaks from a later position, looking back and confirming that the information is still lost. That formula is not exclusive to this passage. It runs through the historical books of the Hebrew Bible like a narrator's signature. When Joshua piles 12 stones in the Jordan, the text says they are there to this day. When the valley of Achor receives its name, the text says it is called that to this day. It's the voice of a narrator situated further along in time, speaking to people who can go and verify it. It's the ancient equivalent of saying, and you can still see it. Now apply it to our case. For the phrase to make sense, enough time must have passed for the ignorance to be an established fact and not the news of the day. If Moses died yesterday, nobody writes that his tomb remains unknown to this day. You write it when the search has already failed, when the generation that was there has gone, when the unknowing has become permanent. The strongest counter-argument exists, and it deserves to be heard in full. A defender of closed Mosaic authorship can tell you this. If you accept that Moses was a prophet, you accept that he received information he couldn't have by natural means. And if he received information about Israel's future, about exile, about kings who didn't yet exist, then receiving the news of his own death and the narrative formula in which it would be told is no greater a leap. It's the same kind of act. Deuteronomy 31, verse 16. Has God telling him he is going to sleep with his fathers? The warning is already in the text. The man knew he was going to die and knew approximately when. That argument is serious, and I won't caricature it. But look at what it fails to explain. It doesn't explain why the text, which just signed its name 3 times in a row, stops signing exactly there. If Moses had prophetically drafted his own obituary, that would be the most astonishing signature in the entire Pentateuch, and a book that records even the place where the scroll was stored would not have passed over it in silence. The silence is not an oversight in a careless text. It is a gap inside a document that is obsessively careful about this exact matter. The second mark is sharper still, and it's in verse 10. It says that there has not arisen since in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. In Hebrew, it begins with velokam, and there has not arisen. It's a reckoning. Someone is counting prophets and finding none of the same size. Measure what it takes to write that sentence. It's not enough for Moses to have died. There must have been prophets afterward, several. Enough for the comparison to mean something. If you write that sentence the month after the funeral, you're not asserting anything. There hasn't been time for anyone to arise. The sentence only has weight if there's a line of names behind it, and the person who writes it has gone through them all and kept Moses at the front. It's a historical verdict, and a historical verdict is issued at the end of the process, not before it begins. The third mark is not a word, it's a voice, and to hear it, I want you to do an exercise. Imagine for a moment that you're writing about yourself. Imagine you have to draft the paragraph that will be read when you're no longer here. What do you sound like? Almost certainly, you sound uncomfortable. You measure the praise. You put it in other people's mouths. You hide behind modesty or exaggerate out of nerves. Nobody writes their own eulogy with a steady hand. Now listen to the last chapter. It says Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. It says the sons of Israel wept for him 30 days in the plains of Moab. It says there has been none like him in all the signs and the wonders, nor in all the mighty hand. And it says all of this without a single hesitation, with the steady pulse of someone talking about another person. It doesn't sound like autobiography. It sounds like an epitaph written by those who remained. There's a detail in another book of the same Pentateuch that is rarely connected to this. Numbers 12 verse 3 describes Moses as the most humble man on all the face of the earth. Read it thinking about who holds the pen. If it's Moses, he just wrote that he is the most humble person on the planet, which is one of the most internally contradictory sentences that can be constructed. The Jewish tradition noticed this centuries ago and offered solutions, some of them ingenious, that God dictated it to him, that the Hebrew word anav doesn't mean exactly humble, but rather afflicted or long-suffering, which fits better in the context of a man attacked by his own siblings. That reading has force, and I don't dismiss it, but notice the pattern. Every time the Pentateuch speaks of Moses in an evaluative tone, the voice behaves like an external voice. It's not an isolated problem with the last chapter. It's a texture that runs through the material. Come up into the scene with me, because the text raises a logistical question that is almost never asked out loud. Imagine the ascent of Mount Nebo. The text describes it with uncommon geographical precision. It says Moses goes up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho, and it says what he sees from there: Gilead and Dan, Naphtali and Ephraim and Manasseh, Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, the plain of the valley of Jericho as far as Zoar, a complete sweep, north to south. It's a scene with two characters, God and a 120-year-old man, no one else. The text is explicit that the people stayed below, in the plains, and that they mourned him there afterward. So the simple question, who came down to tell it? Because the information in that chapter is information from the top of the mountain. What God showed him, what God said to him, that he died there, that he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab. None of those things were seen by the people waiting below, and yet they are written with itinerary-level detail on a page that reached you. There are two ways to answer that. One is that Moses left the account prepared before he went up. The other is that the account came by revelation to whoever wrote it afterward. And here is the point I want you to hold. The second option is not the skeptic's answer. It is, word for word, the answer given by the most conservative Jewish tradition that exists on this matter. Because Rabbinic Judaism didn't avoid this question. It put it in writing, debated it by name, and reached a conclusion that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Before going there, a necessary warning about the sources that follow. Everything I'm going to cite in the next few minutes is outside the Bible. It's ancient and medieval Jewish literature, commentaries, tractates, school discussions. It's not scripture. It doesn't carry Scripture's authority, and at several points, the authors themselves contradict each other. I'm bringing it because it shows how this question was faced for 2 millennia, not because it decides anything. When something is in the biblical text, I'll mark it with chapter and verse, and you'll notice the difference immediately. Let's start with the oldest surviving answer, which is also the boldest. Philo of Alexandria was a Hellenized Jew who wrote in Greek at the beginning of the 1st century, and he devoted 2 entire books to the figure of Moses. In the second of them, near the end, he states that Moses, while still alive, described his own death and told how he was buried. Philo doesn't present this as a problem. He presents it as the logical capstone of a prophetic life. The man who announced the destiny of an entire people announced his own as well. A generation later, Flavius Josephus tells the same thing, but adds something that changes everything: a motive. Josephus was a priest, a general, and later a historian, writing in Rome for a Roman audience he wanted to explain Jews to. In Book 4 of his Jewish Antiquities, in narrating Moses' end, he says that Moses himself left it recorded in the sacred books that he died, and he explains why Moses would have done so, out of fear that people would dare to say that, because of his extraordinary virtue, he had returned to the divine. Read that again, because it's sharper than it appears. Josephus is saying Moses wrote his own death as a preventive measure against his own cult, as if he knew that a people who had just melted a golden calf at the foot of a mountain was perfectly capable of deifying the man who came down from it. Death recorded in writing pins the leader to the ground. He died. He was buried. He didn't ascend. And then Josephus does something disconcerting. In the same passage, he recounts that Moses was saying goodbye to Eleazar and Joshua when a cloud suddenly covered him and he disappeared into a valley. In other words, he narrates what is almost a disappearance, and in the same breath says Moses left his death written down precisely so no one would tell a story of disappearance. The contradiction is inside Josephus, not between Josephus and the Bible. It stands as testimony to the ancient unease, not as data. And there Josephus touches, without knowing it, something the biblical text itself does, because Elijah, centuries later, is indeed taken up. 2 Kings 2 describes the chariot and horses of fire, and the account is explicit that he went up to heaven in a whirlwind. The Bible, when it wants to say someone didn't die, says so. With Moses, it says exactly the opposite. He died there and was buried. Now we go to the document where this question is discussed with more candor than anywhere else in ancient literature. And it is, again, a Jewish document. The tractate Bava Batra of the Babylonian Talmud contains, on folios 14 and 15, something like a catalogue of authorship. It goes book by book, assigning responsibility. Moses wrote his book, plus the section of Balaam and the book of Job. Joshua wrote his book. Samuel wrote his, plus Judges and Ruth. And in the middle of that list appears a sentence worth hearing in full. It says that Joshua wrote his book and 8 verses of the Torah. Count with me. 8 verses. Not a loose gloss, not a minor correction. 8 verses of the 5 books attributed to Moses, assigned to another hand in the central document of Rabbinic Judaism. And those 8 verses are identifiable. They are Deuteronomy 34, verses 5 through 12, from "and Moses died there" to the end of the book. In other words, the tradition that most vigorously defends Mosaic authorship of the Torah had already conceded in writing that the man did not compose the account of his own death. If this is the first time you're hearing this, subscribe, because from here it gets even more interesting. And it didn't go unchallenged. The Talmud records the objection, and it's a theological objection, not a historical one. A teacher raises the problem aloud. If the text says, "And Moses died there," is it possible that Moses wrote that while still alive? And the answer given is that Moses wrote up to that point and Joshua wrote from there. This position is attributed to Rabbi Yehuda, though the text itself admits that some ascribe it to Rabbi Nehemiah. A minor detail that shows we're dealing with a transmitted debate, not a ruling. And then Rabbi Shimon intervenes with a question that is not about Moses. It's about the scroll. He asks whether it's possible that the Torah scroll could be missing even a single letter. And he anchors the objection in a verse you already know, Deuteronomy 31, verse 26, where the command is given to take this book of the law and place it beside the ark. If the book delivered is already called the book of the law, he argues, then it was complete. His concern is not biographical. It's about the integrity of the document. If the scroll Moses deposited beside the ark was incomplete, then for a time there existed a defective Torah, and that for him is unacceptable. His solution is one of the strangest and most beautiful images in all of rabbinic literature. He says that up to that point the Holy One dictated, Moses repeated and wrote. And from that point, the Holy One dictated and Moses wrote in tears. Wrote in tears. Bedamah in Hebrew. The hand copying the news of his own end while the eye clouds over it. I want you to see clearly what just happened on that page, because it's the heart of this entire video. The two rabbis agree on the problem. Neither pretends it doesn't exist. Neither says the question is impious or shouldn't be asked. They debate the solution, and both solutions are legitimate within their framework. One prefers to sacrifice complete authorship to preserve narrative coherence. The other prefers to sacrifice ordinary logic to preserve the integrity of the scroll. And the Talmud prints both side by side without closing the case. Compare that with the discomfort with which this same question is often received today. The ancient version had more stomach. There is a technical detail that confirms this was no marginal curiosity. The same exchange appears in almost the same words in Tractate Menahot, in the context of the rules for copying scrolls. In other words, the discussion was integrated into professional practice, into the scribe's manual, not into after-dinner speculation. Anyone who copied Torah knew that the last 8 lines had a disputed status, and with this, the question changes shape. It's no longer whether someone else wrote the ending. That, even within the most conservative tradition, has been on the table for 1,500 years. The question is who, and with what authority. For that, I need to take you to a verse in another book of the Bible, and this is text, not tradition. Joshua 24, verse 26. The scene is the assembly at Shechem, at the end of Joshua's life. He has gathered the tribes, reviewed the entire history of the people, set before them the decision of whom they will serve. And when the covenant is sealed, the text says this, "And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God." Read it slowly. Joshua wrote, "In the book of the law of God," in Hebrew, Sefer Torah Elohim, the same noun, Sefer, that appeared in Deuteronomy 31 when Moses finished writing and commanded the scroll to be deposited beside the ark. And the subject of the verb is no longer Moses, it's his successor. This is not a rabbinic tradition from the 3rd century. It's not a medieval commentator. It's a verse of the Hebrew Bible saying, without drama, that someone who was not Moses added written material to the book of the law of God. And the text doesn't present it as a transgression. It presents it as what a leader does when he seals a covenant. He records it. Now I need to measure the word carefully, because it's easy to go too far here. Scholars are divided about exactly which Sefer this refers to. One reading says it's the Pentateuch, or the core of Deuteronomy, and that Joshua is writing inside the same document he received. An equally defensible reading says it's a local covenant document from Shechem, a regional scroll recording that specific commitment, distinct from the scroll deposited beside the ark. There's no consensus, and anyone who tells you there is simplifying. But notice what remains standing with either reading. What remains is that the biblical framework contemplates without scandal that an authorized successor can write inside a book of law attributed to God. The objection that only Moses could touch that material doesn't come from the Bible. The Bible, when the matter comes up, treats it with an almost administrative normalness. The same book of Joshua sharpens this further because it distinguishes two things that get confused all the time. In chapter 8, verses 31 and 32, Joshua builds an altar and writes on stones a copy of the law of Moses. There the text is precise, a copy. He reproduces what already existed, transfers it to another medium, displays it publicly. It's the function of a copyist. In chapter 24, by contrast, he doesn't copy. He adds. Two different verbs applied to the same man in the same book, and the narrator doesn't confuse them. He knows perfectly well the difference between reproducing a text and writing inside it. With that in hand, go back to the end of the fifth scroll and look at verse 9, because you'll read it differently now. It says that Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the sons of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. That verse is inside the funeral chapter, and it doesn't speak of a transfer that is going to happen. It speaks of a transfer that has already happened and is already functioning. The people are already obeying. The authority has already been transferred. The voice that narrates Moses' death is a voice writing from the other side of the succession, when the new leadership is already an accomplished and verifiable fact. There's one more piece to come, the deepest one, the one I wanted to give you from the beginning. The very book attributed to Moses institutes prophetic continuity. Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 through 18 has Moses telling the people that the Lord their God will raise up for them a prophet like him from among their brothers, and that they shall listen to him. It's not an isolated promise, it's the creation of an office. Moses, in his own book, establishes that after him there will be authorized voice. Look at the consequence. If the document creates the institution that can continue it, then the continuation is not a failure of the document, it's the document functioning. The missing signature in chapter 34 is not a hole. It's the first exercise of an authority that Moses himself established in writing. Imagine the scene, with a preliminary warning. This part is my reconstruction, not a biblical narrative. Scripture doesn't tell it. I'm assembling it from what the page does say, so you can see the problem as a human problem and not just a library debate. A scene that may have repeated itself in the plains of Moab in the days that followed. The formal mourning has ended. 30 days, the text says, and then people begin to move. There is a scroll deposited beside the ark, with the last line written by a man who no longer exists. And there is an entire community that knows something the scroll doesn't say. That he went up, that he didn't come back, that no one found the place. Probably someone had to decide what to do with that silence. He couldn't leave the book ending in the chapter of the song, as if the protagonist had left the scene without explanation. A scroll kept in the sanctuary cannot be left hanging open in mid-air. And he couldn't invent anything either. The community was alive. There were witnesses to the ascent. Any embellishment would have been noticed. So he did the minimum. He wrote what could be verified and what he was given to know. He went up, he saw. He died there. He was buried in the valley. No one knows where. He was 120 years old. They mourned him 30 days, and there has been none like him. It's a remarkably sober close for a figure of that magnitude. No apotheosis, no rapture, no monumental tomb to visit. If someone had wanted to fabricate the ending of a founder, they would not have fabricated that. They would have fabricated a glorious sepulchre and a place of pilgrimage. And that sobriety, curiously, is the best argument in favor of the passage's honesty. You'll see why when we reach the end. But first comes the most uncomfortable part of this story, and it doesn't come from a modern critic. It comes from a rabbi who believed. His name was Abraham ibn Ezra. He was born in Tudela, in Spain, in the year 1089, and was one of the most complete minds of his generation, grammarian, astronomer, poet, and above all a biblical commentator. His commentary on the Torah is still studied today in yeshivas. Alongside Rashi's, he was not a dissenter, he was canon. And in his commentary on Deuteronomy 1 verse 2, he wrote a paragraph that has been debated for 800 years. Read it slowly, because it was written so as not to be understood at first pass. The paragraph is deliberately obscure. He names what he calls the secret of the 12, and, alongside it, 4 expressions from the Pentateuch, almost without explaining any of them, and closes with a phrase that is at once a key and a warning. And he who understands will recognize the truth. The 4 expressions are these. First, and Moses wrote, from chapter 31, a phrase that speaks of him in third person and past tense. Second, and the Canaanite was then in the land. The annotation of Genesis 12, verse 6. Which only makes sense if whoever writes it lives in a time when they are no longer there. Third, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen, from Genesis 22, verse 14, which presupposes a place of worship already known to the reader. And fourth, behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron, the note about the bed of King Og in Deuteronomy 3, verse 11, which reads like a museum caption, an object on display somewhere you could go see. And the secret of the 12? Ibn Ezra doesn't explain it. The one who deciphered it in writing was his super commentator Joseph Bonfils in a 1370 work called Sofnat Panea. The 12 are the 12 final verses of Deuteronomy. That is, the entire chapter 34. That's the reading most scholars follow today. Stop there, because you just heard something that is almost never said out loud. The Talmud had conceded 8. Ibn Ezra hints at 12. An Orthodox Jewish commentator, still studied today in the most traditional academies, suggested that the entire last chapter of the Torah did not come from Moses' hand, and he didn't lose his place in the canon for it. His commentary kept being printed alongside the sacred text for 800 years. Now, one must be precise about what Ibn Ezra did and what he didn't do. He never states it openly. He encodes it. And that encoding has been read in more than one way. There are interpreters who understand the secret of the 12 as referring to something else, and the debate continues among scholars. Notice the trap. When someone presents Ibn Ezra to you as the first person to deny Mosaic authorship, they are pressing too hard on a text written precisely so it couldn't be pressed. What does remain firm is that he saw the clues, listed them, and chose not to explain them. And 500 years later, someone decided to explain them. Baruch Spinoza published in 1670 the Theological Political Treatise, and in chapter 8, he does something that was explosive in his time. He cites Ibn Ezra by name, reproduces his list, and says the commentator saw the truth, but didn't dare say it clearly. Then Spinoza says it himself. And here comes the part that's almost never told, because it's uncomfortable for both sides. Spinoza misread Ibn Ezra. Twice. The first time, regarding the secret of the 12. Spinoza didn't understand it as the 12 final verses. He understood it as the 12 stones of Deuteronomy 27, on which the law was commanded to be written, and concluded that Ibn Ezra was hinting that Moses' Torah was so short, it fit on 12 stones, far briefer than what we have. Most scholars reject that interpretation. The second time, regarding the formula on the other side of the Jordan, which isn't even in Ibn Ezra's list, Spinoza incorporated it on his own, assuming it referred to the eastern bank, and that Hebrew expression is not that rigid. So the founder of modern biblical criticism built part of his case on a misreading of the rabbi he was citing. That doesn't nullify his other arguments, and that must be said with equal candor. The clues in Genesis and in Deuteronomy still stand on their own, without needing Spinoza. With those two corrections made, what Spinoza argues is that Moses did not write the 5 books that bear his name. He proposes that the Pentateuch and a good portion of the historical books were composed or compiled much later, and he points to Ezra as the compiler. That chapter is one of the starting points of all modern biblical criticism. Spinoza's excommunication from his community had already occurred years earlier for other reasons, but this book sealed his reputation as the great disturber of European theology. The irony worth carrying away is the most important point of this section. The argument most commonly used to dismantle Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch was not manufactured in a hostile laboratory. It was assembled from the marginal notes of a believer. Spinoza didn't discover the clues. He inherited them from a rabbi who had seen them first and who had noted them inside a devotional commentary without stopping to believe. That should change how you receive the question. If a man could notice that chapter 34 speaks in a different voice and go on studying the Torah every day of his life as the Word of God, then noticing the same thing costs you nothing. What you do with the observation is a decision separate from the observation. If you've gotten this far, tell me in the comments which of the answers convinced you most, because all 4 have serious defenders. Now comes the part I owe to the honesty of this channel. Hearing the opposing argument in its best form before responding to it. The modern critical reading doesn't stop at chapter 34. It holds that the Pentateuch is a weaving of materials from different eras, with distinguishable vocabularies, styles, and theological concerns stitched together by editors over centuries. It points to accounts that appear twice with variations, divine names distributed unevenly, laws that contradict each other across books, and geographical notes that presuppose a much later reader. And it places the final chapter of Deuteronomy within a redactional framework that ties the Pentateuch to the historical books that follow. That set of observations is real. I'm not going to deny it or reduce it to bad faith, because most of the work was done on the text itself, verse by verse, and a good deal of it was done by believers. But look at where the limit is, because it exists and it's sharp. The clues Ibn Ezra listed prove one concrete thing, that there are lines written from a point in time later than Moses. That's solid. What they don't prove, and here the reconstructions separate from the evidence, is the date of each layer, the number of hands, the sequence of editions, or the identity of the editors. Those are hypotheses, some better supported than others. And in the last 50 years, several have been reformulated or abandoned by the very scholars who work in the field. The agreement that there was editorial activity is broad. The agreement on how it happened is far less than is usually presented, and there's a logical leap that slips in frequently and deserves to be named. From the fact that a page has more than one hand, it doesn't follow that the content is false. A file with the archivist's notes is not a fabricated file. Who traced the last 8 lines is a question of custody, not of truthfulness. They are 2 distinct questions, and confusing them is the most common mistake in this conversation, whether committed by critics or by defenders. The simplest thing about this case I still haven't told you, and it dismantles the entire objection in an almost embarrassing way. Deuteronomy is not the only book in the Bible that ends with the death of its protagonist. Go to the book of Joshua at the end of chapter 24. After the assembly at Shechem, after the stones and the covenant, the text says that Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old, and they buried him within the territory of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah. And 2 verses later, it adds that Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived him. You recognize the movement: death, burial, and a retrospective balance about the time that followed. It's the same architecture as chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, verse by verse. And the book of Joshua goes further. In its final verses, it also records the death of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, and his burial. A book that closes with 2 funerals, neither of which could have been written by the man whose name it bears. And the Talmud, on that same page of Bava Batra, applies the chain logic without blinking. It says Joshua wrote his book, but that the notice of Joshua's death was added by Eleazar, and the notice of Eleazar's death was added by Phinehas. Each man closes the file of the one before him. Does anyone argue that invalidates the book of Joshua? Nobody. Not Judaism, not Christianity, not critical scholarship. Everyone understands, without needing it explained, that a book named after its protagonist can be closed by the hand of the one who survived him. Move on to Samuel, and the case is even stronger. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 25, verse 1, Samuel dies, and the narrative continues. It continues for 6 more chapters in that book, and then continues for 24 full chapters in the second book that bears his name. In other words, more than half the material attributed to Samuel unfolds after his funeral. Nobody has ever used that as an argument against Scripture. And it's a far more extreme case than ours. In Deuteronomy, we're talking about 8 lines. In Samuel, we're talking about 30 chapters. And look back to the beginning of the Pentateuch, because the pattern is there from the start. Genesis doesn't end with a promise or a genealogy. It ends with the death of Joseph. The last verse of the book says he died at 110 years, that they embalmed him, and that he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Genesis closes with a funeral. Deuteronomy closes with a funeral. The first scroll and the last scroll do the same thing. What you have before you is not an anomaly. It's a compositional convention. In the narrative literature of the Hebrew Bible, the death of the protagonist is the closing formula. It's the genre's period at the end of a sentence. And if it's the normal closing formula, then the presence of that formula at the close of Deuteronomy needs no extraordinary explanation. The strange thing, the truly strange thing, would be for the book to end at the song, without recording Moses' death. A Pentateuch that ended at the Canticle, without recording the death of Moses, would be the only case in which a Hebrew historical book leaves its central figure hanging in midair. The question of the title, then, can be reformulated more precisely. It's not why the book records the death of its protagonist, because they all do. It's why, in this case, it makes us uncomfortable, when in the others, it doesn't. And the answer to that is not in the text, it's in us. It makes us uncomfortable because we attribute the 5 books entire to Moses, and we don't attribute Joshua and Samuel to their namesakes with the same rigidity. The discomfort is produced by our attribution, not by the page. Still to weigh the clues from the list one by one, because I named them in passing and they deserve examination. And that means including the weak ones, because a list where everything convinces equally is a list no one has reviewed. The strongest of all is the bed of Og, Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. The text has just told of the defeat of Og, king of Bashan, and adds a note. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? And it gives the measurements. Read it as what it is, a museum caption. The narrator interrupts the military campaign to tell the reader the object is preserved and tells them where. In Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, which is modern Ammon. It's the construction of someone writing for people who could go see it in a city that was not Israelite, at a time when that object was already a curiosity and not a piece of furniture in use. That verse doesn't work in the mouth of Moses speaking to a people who took that territory the week before. It works from the pen of someone writing much later for an audience that has the piece at hand as a relic. It's the cleanest of the 5 clues, and it doesn't depend on any reconstruction. The second strongest is the note in Genesis 12, verse 6. Abram crosses the land as far as Shechem, and the text adds 4 words, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Then. The Hebrew word is as, and it marks a time different from the time being spoken about. You only say was then, when they are no longer there. Nobody writes that the Canaanites were then in the land if they're there while he's writing. He would simply write that they are there. There is a possible reply, and it should be given. The annotation could be signaling that the territory was already occupied when Abram arrived, without implying anything about the narrator's present. It's a grammatically defensible reading. But when that phrase is placed alongside the others of the same type, the cumulative weight begins to exceed each loose piece. The third is the note of Genesis 22, verse 14, where Abraham calls the place, "The Lord will provide," and it adds that therefore it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Again, the later narrator's formula, and again a place of worship the reader already knows. And then there's the one Spinoza added on his own, the weakest of all, and the one most often cited as though it were decisive. Deuteronomy opens by saying, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan." The Hebrew expression is Bava Batra, and the classical argument says that only someone situated on the western bank would call the other side the region where Moses stood and died. The problem is that the expression is not that rigid. It appears in the Hebrew Bible designating both banks, depending on the speaker's point of view, and sometimes functions almost as a fixed toponym for the Transjordan, without implying where the writer is. Anyone who presents it as conclusive proof is asking more of the phrase than the phrase delivers. There's the honest accounting. 2 strong clues, 1 intermediate, 1 weak that wasn't even Ibn Ezra's, and the secret of the 12, which is our central subject. That's the honest state of the evidence. It's not a closed case and it's not a house of cards. It's a set of observations on the text, some very solid, first made by believers, debated for centuries from within the tradition. And none of them says a word about whether what the book asserts is true, which leaves us with the question of the title, now unadorned. If Moses wrote the 5 books, who wrote the chapter of his death? And the honest answer begins by saying what the text doesn't say. It gives no name, anywhere. And that, which seems like a disappointment, is actually the first hard fact of this section. Because there are 4 real candidates, each with support and with cracks. And I want to go through them one by one, so you can weigh them yourself, instead of accepting whichever one sounds most comfortable. The first is Joshua, and he has the most support. In his favor plays almost everything you've already seen. The Talmud assigns him the final 8 lines. The funeral chapter presents him already invested, already obeyed, with Moses' hands laid on him. And above all, Joshua is the only character in the Hebrew Bible of whom it is expressly said that he put material in writing in a book of the law of God. If you're looking for someone with access, with authority, and with a documented precedent, it's him. Against him is only one thing, but it's heavy. Verse 10, there has not arisen since a prophet like Moses. Joshua is the natural first term of that comparison, and a phrase like that, written by him, would be extremely strange. Furthermore, the formula presupposes a series of later prophets who didn't yet exist in Joshua's lifetime. You can get around it by saying verse 10 is an even later addition than the others. But then you're multiplying hands, and the solution starts to cost more than it resolves. The second candidate is Eleazar, the son of Aaron, or the priestly body in general. This option circulates widely, and one must be precise about it. For chapter 34, it has no basis. Neither the biblical text hints at it, nor does the rabbinic tradition propose it there. Curiously, the Talmud does assign something to Eleazar, but it's something else, the obituary of Joshua, not the obituary of Moses. Whoever transfers that to the end of the Pentateuch is moving an attribution that the source places elsewhere. It's a conjecture that got transmitted until it sounded like information. When someone asserts it with confidence, it's entirely legitimate to ask where they got it, because the answer is going to be the void. The third candidate is the one that emerges from the text itself if you follow it without adding anything. Remember where the scroll ended up. Deuteronomy 31 delivers it to the Levites, the bearers of the ark, and commands it to be placed beside the ark. Custody is Levitical, and the custodians of a sacred document in the ancient Near East were not mere guardians of an object. They were the ones who copied it, kept it legible, and transmitted it. Writing was a specialized craft, transmitted within restricted circles, and in this case the circle is named in the text as the recipient of the scroll. If you ask who had the book in hand when it needed to be closed, the answer the narrative itself gives you is not a proper name. It's a function, the one who kept the ark. The fourth candidate is the one proposed by critical reading, a later redactor who gave the Pentateuch its final form and articulated it with the books that follow. This option explains verse 10 better than any other. Because a redactor who already knows the full history of prophecy in Israel can issue the balance without difficulty. Its weakness is the inverse. It's the one that moves furthest from any verifiable data, because no one can name that redactor or date his work with precision. 4 answers. Count how many seemed obvious to you before you started. And none of them is certainty. The silence about that identity is not a defect. And to see that, you have to step out of the chapter and look at the entire Bible. Do you know how many books of the Hebrew Bible declare their author within the text itself? Very few. Judges doesn't say who wrote it. Ruth doesn't say. The books of Samuel don't say. And in fact, Samuel dies halfway through the first one. Kings doesn't say. Job doesn't say. Esther doesn't say. In the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews, one of the theologically densest texts in the canon, is anonymous, and the ancient church debated its authorship for centuries without resolving it. Before continuing, try to name from memory the author of 3 of those books. Anonymity is the normal condition of biblical narrative, not the exception. The books that carry an author's name are the minority, and it was never the signature that sustained their authority. It was the reception of the community that recognized them, copied them, read them aloud, and kept them in the sanctuary. Applied to our case, this changes the weight of the question. That the last page doesn't say who composed it puts it in the company of almost everything else in the canon. What's unusual isn't that passage. What's unusual are the 3 verses immediately before it where the text does sign, and those are precisely the ones that allowed us to see the contrast. There's one more scene to reconstruct, with the same warning as before. I'm imagining it from what we know of the craft, not from a biblical narrative. Imagine a copyist, centuries later, in some room by lamplight, working on a new scroll. He's done this work his whole life. He knows by heart how many letters fit in each column, And he arrives at the end of the 5th book, at those 8 lines. He knows what you know now. In his training, he was taught that that passage has a disputed status because the discussion was in the manuals of his craft. He knows there are masters who attribute them to Joshua and masters who say Moses himself traced them in tears, and he copies them anyway, letter by letter, without marking a difference, without adding a note, without leaving a different space. Because for him, the question of the hand didn't change the status of the text. The scroll was the scroll. That decision, repeated by thousands of copyists over 2,000 years, is the reason you can read Deuteronomy 34 today exactly where it has always been. The tradition knew the seam and didn't hide it. It discussed it in writing and kept on copying, which leaves us facing the last question, the only one that truly matters at this point. If another hand closed the funeral chapter, what happens with all the times the Bible calls those 5 books the Book of Moses? And that question is no longer debated only in academies, it's debated at kitchen tables. I want to bring all of this down to a concrete scene, because this is not a library debate. It happens every day, and it's probably already happened to you. Imagine a Sunday table. Someone in the family, a 20-year-old nephew, first year of university, drops the phrase without aggression, almost as an interesting fact. Did you know Moses couldn't have written the Bible because the last chapter tells his own burial? He says it with the calm confidence of someone who just discovered something, and the table goes quiet. And at that table, almost always, 2 wrong things happen at the same time. The first is that the person saying it thinks he's bringing news. He doesn't know the objection is at least 2,000 years old, that Philo resolved it in his own way in the 1st century, that the Talmud printed it with 2 opposing answers, and that a 12th century Jewish commentator noted it in the margin of the sacred text without stopping to study it every day. He presents it as a freshly found crack in a wall that in reality has had that joint marked, documented, and debated since before the printing press existed. The second is that the person receiving it treats it as an attack. They tense up, look for a quick answer, and often assert something the Bible doesn't say, that Moses wrote it prophetically, as if that were in the text. It isn't. It's in Philo and in Josephus, who are 1st century Jewish authors, not Bible verses. Defending the book by asserting things the book doesn't assert is the most effective way to lose the next argument when someone goes to verify it. Both of them are debating blind about the same page, and neither has read it slowly. Notice how different that table looks if the conversation has the complete information. There's nothing left to defend, because nothing is under attack. You can say calmly, "You're right, that the chapter was closed by another hand, and the Bible never claimed otherwise. Judaism itself put it in writing 1,500 years ago and has kept reading the entire scroll every week." And then the conversation can move to the question that does matter. What does the book say? Not who held the pen in the last lines. That's worth far more than this one chapter. Go back over how many of the discussions you've had about the Bible were really discussions about a tradition concerning the Bible. That the wise men were 3 when the text gives no number. That the Star of David is in the Old Testament when it never appears. That it was an apple when the text only says fruit. None of those things is on the page, and all of them are defended with the energy with which one defends the page. The cost of that is not intellectual. It's practical. When you defend the addition with the same force as the text, you teach the person across from you that both things carry the same weight. And the day they discover that the addition doesn't hold, they assume the text doesn't hold either. You handed them the map to demolish what you wanted to protect. A detail about our case makes this especially clear. The nephew's objection, as he phrased it, is literally false. He didn't say the last chapter was written by someone else, which is true and touches nothing. He said Moses couldn't have written the Bible, which is an enormous leap from 8 verses to 5 scrolls. And that leap is the exact point where the conversation is decided. From 8 lines written by another hand, nothing follows about the rest. From the fact that the archivist closed the file, nothing follows that he invented the contents. It's the same distinction we made earlier between custody and truthfulness. And it's the one lost at Sunday tables and in internet comment sections in both directions. So the short answer, the one you can use tomorrow, has 3 parts, and all 3 are verifiable. The Bible never claimed Moses wrote those lines. The Jewish tradition identified the exact lines and debated it without hiding it. And the book keeps saying the same thing with that seam in full view, because what a document asserts doesn't depend on who wrote its last page. And to see why that closing could be done without touching anything else, one mental image needs to be corrected, an image that has been distorting the question from the start, and that almost all of us carry without examining it. When you hear the 5 books of Moses, your mind draws a book. Cover, spine, bound pages, an object that opens and closes, and that object didn't exist. In the world in which this material was produced, there were no bound books. There were scrolls, strips of prepared skin or papyrus sewn at the ends to form a continuous band that was rolled onto a rod. And there lies the practical reason the material is distributed across 5. A single scroll containing everything would be unmanageable to hold and to search. While 5 can be handled without difficulty, the word itself gives it away. Pentateuch comes from the Greek, from pente, 5, and teukos, which designated a utensil or container, and in late Greek came to name the case in which a scroll was kept. 5 cases, 5 separate objects, and it's a late name. It appears in Greek around the 2nd century of our era, and in Latin with Tertullian shortly after. Neither Moses nor his contemporaries would have recognized it. The term by which the West knows those books describes a set of containers, not a volume. And this is not an antiquarian's detail. It completely changes the logic of the problem. Note what it implies, that the material is in 5 scrolls and not in a tome. The end of the 5th scroll is a physically accessible location without touching anything else. It's the end of a band. The last column before the rod. Adding 8 lines there doesn't require dismantling the set, or recopying the other 4, or intervening in the middle of anything. It's the simplest operation that can be performed on a document of that type, writing in the space that remains at the end. The closing of the 5th scroll is, in material terms, the only point in the Pentateuch where a later hand can intervene without leaving a structural trace. And it's exactly the point where all traditions, both rabbinic and critical, agree there was intervention. The convergence between what the physical document permits and what the traditions identify is not coincidence. It's the kind of coincidence that in any other discipline would be called convergent evidence. There's another word that deserves to be unpacked because it too has been bending the question. Torah doesn't mean law. We translate it that way through a chain of ancient decisions. The Jewish translators who brought the text into Greek in Alexandria chose nomos, law, and from there it passed into Latin and into all our languages. But the Hebrew word comes from a root having to do with pointing, indicating, showing direction, and in its causative form means to teach. Torah is teaching. Instruction. What a teacher transmits by pointing the way. Why does this matter here? Because it changes the nature of the object we're discussing. A legal code is a closed text. It's promulgated, sealed, and every subsequent modification is an amendment that must be registered. A teaching is something else. A teaching has a teacher, has disciples, has transmission, and its normal mode of existence is to pass from hand to hand. Deuteronomy 31 doesn't describe the promulgation of a code. It describes the delivery of a teaching to a body of custodians with instructions about what to do with it. The text says it should be read aloud every 7 years at the feast before all the people, including the children and the foreigners. It's a document designed to be used, read, and transmitted across generations, and something designed for that carries, built into its own design, the presence of later hands, not as an accident, as a function. This logic is not imported from outside. It's inside the Pentateuch itself, in a way that's almost never commented on. Go back to the 3 scattered signatures I noted at the beginning: the battle record of Amalek, the covenant text, the wilderness itinerary, and notice a detail I let pass then. The recipient of the battle record is Joshua by proper name in Exodus 17. What takes shape is not a single scene of composition. It's a sustained practice of documentary recording across decades, with partial archives, with named recipients, with different purposes in each case: battle records, itineraries, covenant texts, songs, bodies of instruction. And if the Pentateuch is the result of an archival practice and not a single writing session, then the question of who drafted the final stretch stops being a threat and becomes what it always was: a question about the last entry in a file. That's the honest answer to the title's question, and I want to give it to you without ornamentation before reaching the end. Moses did not write the chapter of his death. The text never says he did. It says 3 times what he did write, and the funeral chapter bears the traces of a later voice on its face. Someone who had the scroll in custody after him closed it. That someone has no name in the Bible, and the candidate with the most support within and outside the text is his direct successor. That's all the evidence holds. And none of it touches what the book says, because now we do reach the New Testament, and the precision with which Jesus uses that expression so often misquoted, Mark 12, verse 26. Jesus is debating with the Sadducees about the resurrection of the dead, and he asks them a question. Have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him saying, "I am the God of Abraham"? Listen to how that phrase is constructed, because it's technical. In the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, he's giving an address, corpus, and within the corpus, the section. It's what anyone does who cites a text their interlocutor knows. They name the work and point to the location. It's the ancient way of giving a reference in an era without numbered chapters and verses, where the way to locate a passage was to say which episode it came from. The Book of Moses functions there as a name. It's the label of the set. And to see that a collective name is not a declaration about every individual line, the Bible itself gives you the perfect example in a case that nobody disputes. The Psalms are called, in common usage and in the New Testament itself, the Psalms of David. Jesus himself, a few verses further along in that same chapter of Mark, cites Psalm 110 and says that David spoke by the Holy Spirit. Nobody objects to that attribution. Nobody says Jesus was wrong. And yet the book of Psalms contains compositions whose own headings attribute them to others. There are Psalms of Asaph. There are Psalms of the sons of Korah. There is one of Solomon. And there is one, the 90th, whose heading says, "A prayer of Moses, the man of God." Stop at the irony. The collection the Bible calls of David contains a prayer attributed to Moses. And this generates no crisis and never has, because everyone intuitively understands how the name of a collection works. It points to its principal voice, its origin, its authority, and it doesn't pretend to be a notarial inventory of every piece. Apply it. When the New Testament says the Book of Moses or the Law of Moses, it's doing the same thing it does when it says the Psalms of David. It's naming a corpus by the figure who founded and dominates it, Luke 24, verse 44, has Jesus speaking of the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, the three blocks of the Hebrew canon, each named by its conventional label. It's library vocabulary. It needs to be said what those passages don't do, because excess is tempting in both directions. Jesus never speaks about those final lines. He says nothing about the 8 final lines. To turn Mark 12 into a verdict on who held the pen there is to force the text. And forcing it would be the same error committed by those who use those 8 lines to try to bring down the whole. The passage speaks about the burning bush and about resurrection. That's what it speaks about. What can be affirmed is simpler and stronger. The way the New Testament relates to the Pentateuch doesn't depend at all on who wrote the epitaph. It depends on the authority of the material. When Jesus discusses divorce in Matthew 19, he says Moses permitted it because of the hardness of your hearts. When he confronts the Pharisees in Mark 7, he says Moses said, "Honor your father and your mother." He's invoking a normative voice, a body of instruction with binding weight. He's not issuing a paleographic judgment. Now for the verse that, in my reading, is the center of all of this, John 5, verse 46. Jesus is speaking to those who accuse him and says that if they believed Moses, they would believe him, for Moses wrote of him. Of me he wrote. Weigh what that sentence does to our entire question. We've spent the better part of an hour debating who wrote what, and the New Testament enters from a completely different angle. It doesn't debate the hand, it debates the object. What Moses wrote, says Jesus, had a subject, and the subject was him. That reorders the hierarchy of questions. Who held the pen at the end is a legitimate question, an interesting one, and you've seen that the Jewish tradition treated it with seriousness for 2 millennia. But it's a question about the container. The question about the contents is a different one, and it's the one that decides everything else. One last piece remains, the one that closes the arc and explains why this chapter ends where it ends. Because the last page doesn't end at the tomb, it ends at a vacancy. And that vacancy is formulated in a way the rest of the Bible never lets go. Go back to verse 10, but now look at it as the ending of a book, not as biographical data. The last word of the Torah about Moses is a comparison no one wins. There has not arisen a prophet like him. It's a negative sentence. After 5 scrolls, after creation, the flood, the patriarchs, Egypt, the sea, Sinai, 40 years of desert, and an entire body of instruction, the document closes by recording an absence. This is the finest seam in all of the Pentateuch. 16 chapters earlier, in the same book, Moses made a promise. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. He's speaking to the people about what they must not do, about diviners and soothsayers among the nations. And in the middle of that, he says this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. To him you shall listen." A prophet like me. It's the same expression, the same comparison, the same measuring rod. Put them together. In chapter 18, the book promises a prophet like Moses. In chapter 34, the book closes by saying none has appeared. The Pentateuch ends with its own promise unfulfilled. That's not a compilation accident. It's a constructed tension. Whoever closed that scroll had before them the promise of chapter 18 and chose to end the whole with the confirmation that the waiting was still open. He could have closed with the eulogy and nothing more. He could have closed with the mourning. He chose to close with a vacancy, and that vacancy is what the Bible never let go. I need to give you the traditional Jewish reading of chapter 18 here, because it's solid and deserves to be heard. For the majority rabbinic interpretation, that verse doesn't announce a single figure at the end of history. It institutes the prophetic office in Israel. It establishes that God will keep raising up prophets, plural, functionally, generation after generation, in contrast to the divination methods of neighboring peoples. And the immediate context supports that reading because the following verses give criteria for distinguishing the true prophet from the false, which only makes sense if several are going to appear. It's a serious reading, and the person who holds it is reading the context, not ignoring it. However, notice what that reading doesn't resolve, and it doesn't resolve it because the text itself won't let it. If chapter 18 only institutes the office, then the end of the Torah should record that the office functioned. And it records the opposite. It says there were prophets, and none of them measured up. The close of the book doesn't say the institution was established. It says no one reached the height of the mold. The vacancy remains, and it's written in the last verse of the Torah. And the first Christian preaching went straight to that verse, not to an obscure text, not to a labored allegory, to the promise of chapter 18, cited literally. Acts 3. Peter is in the temple in Solomon's portico after the healing of the man at the gate called Beautiful. And in the middle of his speech, he cites Moses, saying that the Lord will raise up a prophet like him from among their brothers, and that they shall listen to him in everything he says. He's placing a name in the vacancy, and it's not an isolated case. Acts 7. Stephen, in the speech that cost him his life before the Sanhedrin, traces the entire history of Israel and returns to the same verse. He cites Moses announcing the prophet like him. It's the same move, in the same decade, before the same audience. The first people who preached Jesus as Messiah didn't arrive there from outside the Torah. They arrived by reading the gap the Torah left open in its own last line. And here is where the two things we've been following for this entire time turn out to be the same shape. The close of the fifth scroll has no signature, and it has no prophet either. An anonymous hand wrote the sentence that keeps the expectation alive, and in doing so, erased itself from the narrative. It left no name. It left a vacancy and a promise. Consider the kind of person who does that. He had the most important scroll of his people in his hands at the moment when it needed to be closed, and he had the opportunity to write anything in the space that remained. He could have named himself. He could have added his lineage, his authority, the reason he was the right one to finish it. That's what scribes in the ancient world did when they wanted to be remembered. We have colophons of that type from across Mesopotamia. He did none of that. He wrote that his teacher died, that no one knows where he's buried, and that no one has reached his height, and he disappeared. The unsigned page of the Torah is the most humble page of the Torah, and it is exactly the one that points forward. This channel holds that the name that goes in that vacancy is Jesus of Nazareth, not as a sentimental conclusion, but for the reason he himself gave in John 5 verse 46, that Moses wrote of him. What was left open in the last verse of the fifth scroll, Peter closed in Solomon's portico with a name, citing the same book. So when someone tells you the Bible falls apart because Moses couldn't have written his own death, you now know what to say. That the Bible never claimed he did, that the Talmud debated it 1,500 years ago and published both positions, that a medieval rabbi noted it in his commentary and kept on believing, and that the chapter ends where it ends because it was waiting for someone. If you want to keep reading the Bible this way, with the text in front of you and without hiding its seams, the next one is on your screen. Now think about your own way of reading. How many things you defend from the Bible that the Bible doesn't say? How many times you've felt a question was an attack when it was only a question? How many times the answer that frightened you was printed centuries ago in the margin of the very text you were defending? The man who closed the Torah was not afraid to write that he didn't know where the tomb was. He wrote the ignorance and left it there without covering it over, and the scroll went on being the scroll. And if that page has held up 2,000 years without a signature, your faith can hold up one question.